On the morning of August 15, 1893, a panic telegram arrived at the Newport Police Department, setting in motion one of the Gilded Age's most unsettling unresolved mysteries. Evangelene Cunningham, a 23-year-old heiress to a railroad fortune valued at over $40 million, had disappeared without a clue from her family's seaside estate during the most prestigious social gathering of the Newport season. What made her vanishing truly unnerving went beyond the situation itself. It was what authorities discovered concealed within her private rooms. Meticulous photographs of 13 prominent Newport families, each one marked with mysterious symbols, a leather-bound journal filled with names, dates, and dollar amounts that would entangle some of America's most powerful industrialists in a decade-spanning network of blackmail and murder. And most alarming of all, a set of forged death certificates bearing the signatures of 3 different coroners. Each one documented deaths officially classified as accidental, yet all displayed identical signs of arsenic poisoning. For more than a century, the Cunningham family leveraged their power to keep these findings hidden, maintaining that Evangelene perished in a tragic mishap overseas. Federal agents who tried to examine the evidence found their access inexplicably barred by court orders authorized by judges with financial connections to the very railroad interests Evangelene had been looking into. Local newspaper editors who initially pursued the story abruptly changed their minds after visits from well-dressed gentlemen who spoke softly about dire outcomes for those who spread harmful gossip about upstanding citizens. But recently uncovered court papers and witness accounts reveal a much darker picture of that August night in 1893. A trove of letters discovered within the walls of a torn-down Providence mansion indicates that Evangelene had been collaborating with a network of private detectives, foreign correspondents, and even federal agents who were covertly building a case for what they called the American Conspiracy. A methodical campaign of murder and corruption that infiltrated the highest echelons of government and commerce. Before we proceed with the story of Evangelene Cunningham and the shadowy secrets that may have taken her life, please subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments which state or city you're listening from. We adore hearing from our community of mystery enthusiasts who help us bring these buried truths to light. Tonight, we will present evidence indicating that Evangelene's disappearance was not a solitary event, but part of a sequence of removals that took the lives of no fewer than 37 people who threatened to expose what period documents called the Newport Compact, a secret pact among America's wealthiest families who had petitioned the nation's resources among themselves and were ready to kill anyone who opposed their authority. Newport in the summer of 1893 was the uncontested crown jewel of American high society. But underneath its brilliant surface lay a tangled web of secrets, competition, and simmering violence that would have stunned the American public had they known the reality. The coastal Rhode Island town had evolved from a humble colonial settlement into what the press dubbed America's Monte Carlo. A playground where railroad barons, steel magnates, and shipping dynasties vied to outshine one another with displays of unimaginable wealth. The renowned Bellevue Avenue had become a parade of marble palaces posing as summer homes, each more lavish than the one before, their construction having cost the lives of numerous immigrant laborers whose deaths were seldom documented or looked into. The metamorphosis of Newport into this gilded paradise had been meticulously arranged by a small cluster of families who understood that concentrated wealth demanded not just business savvy but also refined methods of social management. They had learned from the labor disputes and political tests of the 1870s and 1880s that public sentiment could be a danger to their interests. Newport was their answer, a closed community where they could plot business tactics, arrange marriages for their children, and coordinate responses to threats without worrying about outside observation. The Cunningham family held a place of special distinction in this rarefied world. Harrison Cunningham had constructed his empire through the Baltimore and Newport Railroad, a system linking the major industrial hubs of the Northeast that had become vital for moving coal, steel, and manufactured goods. By 1893, his wealth was estimated at over $40 million, equal to more than $1 billion in today's currency. But this number represented only his declared assets. Private banking records, which wouldn't be found until the 1970s, showed that Cunningham controlled shadow companies worth at least another $20 million, including mining operations in Colorado, timber firms in the Pacific Northwest, and shipping companies that operated under foreign flags to bypass American labor regulations. The family's Newport estate, Windward Hall, stood imposingly on a 12-acre bluff overlooking the Atlantic. Its 68 rooms were filled with treasures gathered from across Europe. But the mansion also contained features few visitors ever saw, a private telegraph office linked directly to railroad dispatch centers, a document vault with walls thick enough to withstand dynamite, and a network of underground tunnels connecting to similar facilities at neighboring estates. These elements reflected the fact that Newport's social season was as much about coordinating business schemes as it was about entertainment. But it was Harrison's daughter, Evangelene, who truly fascinated Newport society while simultaneously posing its most significant internal danger. Described by those who knew her as having an almost unearthly beauty, she had returned from 3 years at European finishing schools with an education that went far beyond what was deemed suitable for young women of her standing. She was fluent in 4 languages, had studied philosophy and literature at the Sorbonne, and possessed what her governess tactfully called an uncomfortably inquisitive mind. Even more troubling for her family's interests, she had also received instruction in accounting, business law, and investigative methods from professors who had no idea they were teaching someone who would use these abilities to endanger the entire framework of American corporate power. At 23, Evangelene had already turned down marriage proposals from 2 European counts and the son of a Pennsylvania steel magnate, much to her parents' increasing alarm. But her refusals were not based on romantic feelings. They came from her realization that each of these suitors had been chosen specifically because their families were involved in the same web of corruption that her father's business empire relied upon. Through diligent investigation, she had learned that the European counts acted for banking interests that laundered profits from American industrial accidents, while the steel magnate's son was personally accountable for the deaths of more than 40 workers in a series of avoidable mine collapses. The summer of 1893 had been especially tense for the Cunningham family and for all of Newport's elite families. Harrison's health was deteriorating, though few understood that his symptoms matched those of other business leaders who had started to question the tactics of the Newport Compact. Questions about the railroad succession had begun to circulate among business partners and rivals alike, particularly because several recent accidents had removed potential challenges to Cunningham's command of key transportation routes. Evangelene, as the sole heir, would inherit everything, but only if she married before her 25th birthday, according to the conditions of her grandfather's will. This legal requirement had created an air of urgency that hung over every social event that season, but it had also given Evangelene a powerful negotiating position. She had quietly hinted to her parents' business associates that her cooperation with the marriage rule might depend on getting satisfactory answers to certain questions about the family's business dealings. The wider context of 1893 added another layer of complexity to Newport's already intricate social dynamics. The nation was in the grip of the Panic of 1893, a severe economic depression that had started that spring when the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad Company collapsed, setting off a wave of bank failures and business bankruptcies. While the wealthy residents of Newport seemed largely shielded from the financial crisis, many fortunes were quietly fading, and several prominent families had been compelled to sell their mansions or withdraw to smaller residences, though they maintained their public facade of prosperity. What the general public did not know was that the Panic of 1893 had been deliberately engineered by the Newport Compact as a way to strengthen their grip on American industry. By manipulating credit markets and triggering strategic bankruptcies, they had managed to acquire competitors' assets for a fraction of their true value while their own wealth remained protected through foreign bank accounts and shell companies. In this environment of manufactured crisis and concealed desperation, Evangelene Cunningham's vast inheritance had taken on an almost legendary quality within Newport's social circles. The psychological atmosphere of Newport in 1893 was further complicated by the presence of many European visitors who had come not just for social reasons but as representatives of banking and industrial interests seeking to establish footholds in the American economy. Many of these visitors were taken aback by the level of violence and intimidation they found among America's business elite. Count Friedrich von Stauffen, a German banker who attended several Newport social events that summer, wrote in his private diary, "The Americans talk of business competition, but what I see here is more like medieval warfare fought with modern weapons. These people have organized themselves into feudal domains, each guarding its territory through methods that would shock even the most ruthless European industrialists." The Count's observations were especially insightful because he had witnessed several incidents that other guests either missed or chose to disregard. During a garden party at the Patton estate, he had seen Theodore Patton in a heated discussion with a man who appeared to be a federal government official. The conversation concluded with Pemberton handing the official a leather briefcase, after which the official left immediately without taking part in the social events. When von Stephan discreetly asked about the incident, he was told that such exchanges were routine business matters that need not concern social guests. The evening of August 14, 1893, started like countless others on Newport's social calendar, but accounts from the time suggest that many attendees knew they were witnessing what might be the final act of a drama that had been building for months. The Cunninghams were hosting their annual summer's end ball, a tradition that had become one of the most sought-after invitations of the season, but also a gathering that served purposes well beyond social amusement. Over 300 guests had been invited to Windward Hall, representing not only the pinnacle of American and European society, but also a carefully chosen group of politicians, judges, journalists, and business leaders whose cooperation was crucial to maintaining the Newport Complex's command over American commerce. The mansion was ablaze. With electric lights, still a novelty in 1893, and a display of technological sophistication that few private homes could match. The electrical system had been installed not just for lighting, but also to power a private telephone exchange that let the Cunningham family maintain instant contact with railroad dispatch centers, stock exchanges, and telegraph offices across the country. Chinese lanterns lit up the terrace gardens that sloped down toward the ocean. But concealed among the decorative lights were calcium lamps that could instantly flood the entire estate grounds with light if security issues arose. The guest list for that evening revealed the true nature of Newport's social structure. Among those present were Senator Marcus Hale of Pennsylvania, who had consistently voted against railroad safety legislation, Judge Cornelius Weatherby of the Rhode Island Supreme Court, who had dismissed numerous lawsuits against industrial companies, and Dr. Edmund Sheffield, the state medical examiner, whose death certificates had allowed dozens of industrial accidents to be classified as acts of God instead of corporate negligence. Also in attendance were 3 foreign diplomats whose governments had been quietly negotiating trade agreements that would give American corporations preferential access to overseas markets in exchange for substantial private payments to European officials. Evangelene appeared that evening in a gown of pale blue silk, wearing the famous Cunningham sapphires, a necklace worth more than most people would earn in several lifetimes, but which also held a hidden compartment containing several of her most damaging pieces of evidence against the Newport Compact. Those who spoke with her later remembered that she seemed unusually lively, almost excited, though several guests noted an underlying tension in her manner that hinted she was preparing for some decisive action. Mrs. Eleanora Sedgwick, wife of a Boston banking magnate who had herself been looking into irregularities in railroad financing, would later tell investigators that Evangelene had drawn her aside during the first waltz, whispering urgently, "Eleanora, if anything should happen to me tonight, remember that you saw me speaking with Theodore Patton near the conservatory. Remember the time. It was exactly 9:15. But more importantly, remember that I gave you this." At that moment, Evangelene had slipped a small key into Mrs. Sedgwick's gloved hand, adding, "Post Office Box 247 in Providence. The combination is my birthday in reverse. Whatever you find there, make sure it gets to the Boston Herald and the New York World at the same time." Theodore Patton was a 34-year-old heir to a Pittsburgh steel fortune and one of Evangelene's most persistent suitors, but his interest in marriage was driven by business concerns rather than romantic affection. Known for his volatile temper and gambling debts exceeding $200,000, Patton had been pressuring the Cunningham family for months to let him court Evangelene formally. What few people knew was that Patton's debts were owned by the Newport Compact itself, having been bought from his original creditors as a way to guarantee his cooperation with the organization's activities. That evening, witnesses saw several heated conversations between Patton and Heiress Cunningham, though the content of these discussions remained private. However, James Weather, the judge's son and a junior partner in the Cunningham railroad business, was placed where he could hear parts of these exchanges. According to his later testimony, Heiress Cunningham was trying to persuade Pemberton that more direct methods might be necessary to resolve the Evangelene situation. While Patton voiced concern about the foreign complications that such methods might create, the foreign complications referred to Evangelene's extensive correspondence with European journalists and investigators who had been documenting the international scope of American corporate corruption. Through her European education contacts, she had built relationships with reporters from the London Times, the Paris Le Figaro, and the Berlin Tageblatt, all of whom were preparing exposes about American business practices that broke international law. The Newport Compact had already paid substantial bribes to suppress some of these stories, but Evangelene's cooperation was essential to preventing a coordinated international campaign that could lead to trade sanctions and diplomatic repercussions. As the evening went on, Evangelene moved through the crowd with an almost frantic energy, engaging in unusually long conversations with various guests, many of whom later reported feeling that she was somehow testing their knowledge or loyalties. Professor Marcus Aldrich of Yale University, who was present as the guest of a prominent Newport family, later recalled being surprised when Evangelene approached him with detailed questions about recent archaeological finds in Egypt. She seemed particularly interested in methods for preserving documents and artifacts for long periods, he would later tell authorities. She asked specifically about waterproof containers and whether organic materials could survive being buried in coastal soil for decades or even centuries. Dr. Sheffield, the medical examiner, found himself engaged in what he first thought was casual conversation about forensic medicine, but which he later realized had been a sophisticated interrogation about methods for detecting various poisons and drugs in decomposed remains. Evangelene had shown knowledge of forensic techniques that went far beyond what any society lady should possess, asking specific questions about how long different substances remained detectable in human tissue and whether certain toxins could be mistaken for natural diseases. At approximately 10:30 p.m., during the peak of the evening's festivities, Evangelene excused herself from the ballroom, saying she needed to get a family heirloom from her private chambers to show to Count von Stephen, who had expressed interest in American railroad history. This was not unusual behavior. The Cunninghams were known for their impromptu displays of their art collection and historical papers. However, what was unusual was that Evangelene specifically asked that no servants accompany her, insisting she could manage alone and wanted to choose the items herself. What guests did not know was that Evangelene's request to show historical documents to Count von Stephen was actually a coded signal she had arranged weeks earlier. The Count was not just a casual visitor, but a representative of European banking interests who had been looking into American railroad financing irregularities at the request of several German investors who suspected they were being cheated. Evangelene had been secretly giving him information about the Newport Compact's international operations, and her mention of retrieving documents was his signal to prepare for the final transfer of evidence that would expose the conspiracy to European authorities. The last confirmed sighting of Evangelene Cunningham was by James Weatherby, who saw her on the mansion's grand staircase at 10:45 p.m. According to Weatherby's detailed testimony, Evangelene was coming down the stairs quickly, carrying what looked like a small leather case or portfolio, but also a larger canvas bag that seemed to hold bulky items. When he offered to escort her back to the ballroom, she refused, saying, "There are some truths that are more important than social propriety, James. Some secrets that can no longer be kept. Your father will understand soon enough what I mean." Weatherby later recalled that Evangelene's manner was not fearful, but rather determined and almost exhilarated, as if she was finally taking action on something she had been planning for a long time. She had also made a cryptic comment about insurance policies that have already been activated, adding that certain letters were posted this afternoon that will ensure the truth survives regardless of what happens to me tonight. When Evangelene failed to return to the ballroom after an hour, her mother, Constance Cunningham, sent servants to check her chambers. They found her room empty with clear signs of hasty packing. A window overlooking the ocean was open, and several valuable items were missing, including a significant amount of jewelry and cash. Most mysteriously, Evangelene's private safe had been opened, not forced, but opened with the correct combination, and whatever documents it had contained were gone. However, the servants also found evidence that suggested the room had been searched by multiple people after Evangelene's departure. Furniture had been moved slightly. Hidden compartments had been located and examined, and even the floorboards showed signs of having been pried up and then carefully replaced. This suggested that whatever Evangelene had taken from her safe, other parties had known of its existence and had conducted their own search for additional materials she might have left behind. The immediate response to Evangelene's disappearance revealed the complex web of relationships and rivalries that defined Newport's Gilded Age society. But it also showed the sophisticated methods that America's wealthiest families had developed for controlling information and managing potential scandals. Harrison Cunningham's first instinct was to control the narrative, immediately hiring private investigators from the Pinkerton Detective Agency instead of relying only on local law enforcement. This decision would later prove critical as it let the family suppress evidence that might have led to a quicker resolution of the case, but it also revealed how much local authorities had already been compromised by corporate influence. The Pinkerton agents, led by Detective Captain William Harrington, started their investigation by examining Evangelene's personal effects and questioning the mansion staff. What they found painted a picture of a young woman who had been living a far more complex and dangerous life than anyone had suspected. Hidden compartments in her writing desk revealed correspondence with lawyers, bankers, federal investigators, and what appeared to be private detectives from as far away as Chicago, San Francisco, and even London and Paris. The letters discussed irregularities in railroad contracts, falsified safety inspections, systematic bribery of federal officials, and most disturbing of all, coordinated elimination of inconvenient witnesses. Captain Harrington, who had 20 years of experience investigating corporate crimes, later wrote in his private notes that Evangelene's collection of documents was the most comprehensive evidence of systematic corruption he had ever encountered. Her files contained not just accusations and suspicions, but actual copies of forged documents, photographs of secret meetings, and what appeared to be detailed financial records showing the flow of bribe money through various shell companies and foreign bank accounts. More disturbing were the detailed notes Evangelene had been keeping about the personal lives and business activities of Newport's most prominent families. A private journal written in a cipher that took the Pinkerton agents 3 weeks to decode with help from cryptography experts from the Treasury Department contained damaging information about extramarital affairs, business frauds, political corruption, and what appeared to be an organized conspiracy among several railroad companies to fix prices, eliminate competition, and suppress safety investigations. One entry dated just 2 days before her disappearance read, "The Pinkerton contracts are fraudulent. I now have documentary proof that the steel used in the Baltimore Bridge construction was deliberately swapped with substandard materials to increase profit margins. TP personally approved the substitution, knowing that structural failure was virtually inevitable. The original engineering specifications called for grade A steel throughout, but the delivered materials were grade C with falsified certificates. The engineering consultant who found the substitution, Robert Henley, died in a hotel fire 3 days after submitting his report. His replacement, Dr. Marcus Webb, was paid $50,000 to certify the substandard materials as acceptable. The Baltimore Bridge, mentioned in Evangelene's notes, had collapsed 6 months earlier during the morning rush hour, killing 17 workers and injuring dozens more. The official investigation had concluded that the disaster was caused by an unexpected ice storm that had placed unanticipated stress on the structure, but Evangelene's documents suggested a far more sinister explanation. If her allegations were true, Theodore Peton and potentially other members of Newport society were guilty of premeditated murder disguised as corporate negligence. As Captain Harrington's investigation progressed, he began to uncover a pattern of suspicious accidents and mysterious deaths connected to the various business enterprises controlled by Newport's elite families. In the past 5 years alone, at least 18 individuals who had been involved in investigating railroad safety violations, steel quality issues, financial irregularities, or labor organizing, had died under circumstances that, while officially ruled accidental, showed troubling similarities when examined together. The most disturbing case involved David Cavendish, a federal railway inspector who had been looking into safety violations on the Baltimore and Newport line just 18 months before Evangelene's disappearance. Cavendish had been found dead in his Baltimore hotel room, apparently from a heart attack. However, his widow had insisted that her husband was in perfect health and had recently passed a comprehensive medical examination required for his federal employment. More significantly, she revealed that her husband had been getting threatening letters for weeks before his death and had recently bought a substantial life insurance policy after confiding in her that he had found evidence of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government and business. Mrs. Cavendish had tried to give her husband's investigation files to federal authorities, but the documents had mysteriously vanished from their home during the funeral, apparently taken by individuals who had entered without breaking any locks or windows. When she contacted the Cunningham family directly, seeking answers about her husband's death and requesting access to railroad safety records that might support his investigation, she received a visit from 2 well-dressed men who identified themselves as representatives of interests concerned with preventing the spread of malicious rumors. The visitors had not explicitly threatened Mrs. Cavendish, but they had made it clear that her husband's investigation had been based on misunderstandings and incomplete information that could lead to unfortunate legal consequences if she continued to make accusations against respected business leaders. They had also pointed out that her husband's federal pension would be at risk if his final investigation were deemed to have been conducted improperly, and that her own job as a school teacher might be affected if local authorities received reports about her unstable mental state following her husband's death. Shortly after this visit, Mrs. Cavendish received a substantial anonymous payment that arrived with a note suggesting she would be wise to drop her inquiries and move to a different city where she could start fresh without the burden of painful memories. She had complied, moving to Oregon and never speaking publicly about her husband's death again, but not before secretly giving copies of his remaining investigation notes to a journalist friend who had promised to continue the investigation. That journalist, Michael O'Connor of the Baltimore Sun, had started his own investigation into railroad safety violations, but his efforts had been systematically blocked by officials who claimed that relevant documents had been misfiled or destroyed in routine housekeeping. When O'Connor tried to interview other federal inspectors, he discovered that several had been transferred to remote locations while others had been promoted to positions where they no longer had access to operational safety data. O'Connor's investigation had also revealed that the pattern of inspector deaths extended beyond the Cavendish case. In the past 3 years, 7 federal inspectors working on railroad safety issues had died in circumstances that, while individually plausible, formed a statistically impossible pattern when considered together. 3 had suffered heart attacks despite having no prior cardiac problems. 2 had died in hotel fires that destroyed their investigation files. 1 had drowned under circumstances that suggested he had been drugged before entering the water, and 1 had been killed in what appeared to be a random robbery that occurred just days before he was scheduled to testify before a congressional committee about safety violations. The most chilling discovery in Evangelene's files was a document that appeared to be a price list for various services provided by what was called the Newport Adjustment Bureau. The document, written in code but with a key that Evangelene had apparently broken, listed fees for permanent solutions to persistent problems, accidental resolution of inconvenient situations, and comprehensive reputation management services. The prices ranged from $5,000 for simple intimidation to $50,000 for permanent elimination with complete documentary cleanup. Captain Harrington's investigation with this document led him to discover that the Newport Adjustment Bureau was apparently a real organization operating out of offices in New York, Chicago, and San Francisco that provided what it advertised as discreet consulting services for industrial concerns. However, when Harrington tried to investigate the organization directly, he found that its offices were closed, its staff had vanished, and its business records had been removed from all official repositories. 3 weeks after Evangelene's disappearance, Captain Harrington made a discovery that would fundamentally change the direction of the investigation and reveal the true scope of the conspiracy that Evangelene had been documenting. While examining the grounds of Windward Hall with greater care, using techniques he had learned during his military service in tracking hidden enemy positions, he noticed that the soil in a particular section of the estate's extensive gardens showed signs of having been recently disturbed. The area was located near the mansion's conservatory, close to where Evangelene had reportedly been seen speaking with Theodore Patton earlier in the evening, but it was also positioned where it could be seen from several windows of the mansion, suggesting that whoever had disturbed the soil had been either extremely bold or confident that they would not be interrupted. Using specialized excavation techniques that were just beginning to be used in criminal investigations, Harrington and his team carefully dug up the site. What they found was not Evangelene's body, but something equally significant and far more dangerous to the perpetrators. A waterproof metal container buried about 4 feet underground, wrapped in oiled canvas and sealed with wax to prevent moisture damage. Inside were copies of the documents that had vanished from Evangelene's safe, along with additional materials that painted an even more damning picture of corruption among Newport's elite families and revealed the international scope of their criminal activities. The buried archive contained detailed financial records showing systematic embezzlement from the Baltimore and Newport Railroad's worker pension fund, forged safety inspection certificates for at least 12 major construction projects across the Northeast, evidence of bribery involving federal officials, judges, and local politicians, and most shocking of all, detailed correspondence with European criminal organizations that specialized in what the documents euphemistically termed industrial problem resolution. According to Evangelene's documentation, what she had labeled the Newport Compact was not just a business conspiracy, but an American branch of an international network of wealthy families who had been coordinating their activities across national borders since the 1870s. The compact included the Cunninghams, the Pinkertons, and 5 other American families, but it also maintained formal relationships with similar organizations in England, Germany, France, and even Russia. These international connections let them launder money, hide assets, eliminate inconvenient individuals in multiple countries, and manipulate commodity markets on a global scale. The most detailed document in the archive was a comprehensive organizational chart that revealed the full structure of the Newport complex operations. At the top level were the 7 American families, each controlling specific industrial sectors: railroads, steel production, coal mining, shipping, banking, textiles, and agricultural commodities. Below them were dozens of subsidiary organizations, private detective agencies, legal firms, medical practices, newspaper companies, and what appeared to be several funeral establishments that specialized in discreet body disposal. One particularly disturbing section of the archive documented what Evangelene had called the American Death List, a comprehensive record of individuals who had been eliminated by the Newport Compact since its formation in 1877. The list included federal investigators, journalists, labor organizers, business competitors, and even family members who had threatened to expose the organization's activities. Each entry included the person's name, occupation, the specific threat they posed, the method used to eliminate them, and the cost of the operation. The death list revealed that the Newport Compact had been responsible for at least 43 murders over 16 years using methods that ranged from poisoning and staged accidents to what appeared to be hired assassinations disguised as random crimes. The victims included not only American citizens, but also several Europeans who had been investigating American business practices at the request of their governments. Among the most shocking entries was the death of Congressman William Hayes of Ohio, who had been leading a congressional investigation into railroad safety violations. Hayes had died in 1891 of what was officially ruled a heart attack. But the archive revealed that he had been poisoned with a substance that mimicked cardiac failure, administered during a dinner at the Union Club in Washington that had been attended by several Newport Compact members. Another entry documented the elimination of Sarah Mitchell, a journalist for the Chicago Tribune, who had been investigating connections between industrial accidents and political corruption. Mitchell had died in a hotel fire that destroyed not only her life, but also her investigation files. The archive revealed that the fire had been deliberately set using a new type of accelerant that burned so quickly and completely that it left no trace of arson, and that Mitchell had been drugged before the fire was set to ensure she could not escape. Perhaps the most chilling discovery in the archive was a document that appeared to be Angelena's own death warrant, written in the hand of Judge Cornelius Weatherby, countersigned by Theodore Pitton and Heiress Cunningham himself. The document, dated 3 days before the Summer's End Ball, read, "The EC situation has become untenable. Foreign complications require immediate resolution. Recommend permanent solution with careful attention to documentary cleanup. Suggest maritime disposal to prevent forensic complications. Authorization granted for expenditure up to $75,000 for comprehensive resolution." Attached to this document was a detailed plan for Evangelene's murder, including the method to be used, a drug that would cause apparent heart failure, the location where her body would be disposed of, weighted and dropped into deep ocean water from a private yacht, and the cover story that would be given to authorities in the press. She had fled with a secret lover to Europe, but had subsequently died in a tragic accident abroad. Plan also included provisions for eliminating any witnesses who might complicate the cover story, with Margaret Flynn and Patrick O'Brien specifically identified as individuals who would need to be managed to prevent them from providing inconvenient testimony. The document noted that Flynn could be discredited by spreading rumors about her mental stability and alcohol consumption, while O'Brien could be transferred to a different position, or if necessary, eliminated in a manner that would appear to be a workplace accident. Captain Harrington's discovery of this archive created an immediate crisis for his investigation. On one hand, he now possessed comprehensive evidence of a criminal conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of American business and government. On the other hand, he realized that his own life was now in danger, as the archive made clear that the Newport Compact had extensive resources for eliminating threats and had already shown their willingness to kill federal investigators. Harrington's concerns proved to be well-founded. Within days of his discovery of the archive, he began to experience pressure from unexpected sources. His superiors at the Pinkerton agency suggested that he was pursuing unproductive lines of inquiry and recommended focusing on the theory that Evangelene had simply fled with a secret lover. When Harrington refused to drop his investigation, pointing out that the evidence clearly indicated a murder conspiracy, he was told that the Cunningham family had complained about his harassment of their associates and had requested that he be removed from the case. More ominously, Harrington began to receive subtle but unmistakable threats. His hotel room was searched while he was conducting interviews. No items stolen, but his investigation notes clearly examined. He got anonymous letters suggesting that his wife and children in Chicago might be safer if he concluded his investigation quickly and returned home. Most disturbing of all, he found that someone had been making inquiries about his personal finances, family background, and potential vulnerabilities that could be exploited if more direct methods of influence proved necessary. Recognizing that his position had become untenable, Harrington made a decision that probably saved his life, but also ensured that the truth about Evangelene's disappearance would remain hidden for decades. He secretly made multiple copies of the most important documents from the archive, hiding them in various locations and arranging for them to be delivered to trusted associates if anything happened to him. He then officially concluded his investigation with a report that largely supported the theory that Evangelene had fled voluntarily while privately continuing to investigate the case through unofficial channels. As Captain Harrington delved deeper into the Newport Compact through his unofficial investigation, he began to understand that Evangelene's disappearance was not an isolated incident, but rather the culmination of a systematic campaign to eliminate the most serious threat the organization had ever faced. What made Evangelene particularly dangerous was not just her access to inside information about her family's business operations, but her sophisticated understanding of how to gather evidence, preserve it securely, and coordinate with multiple investigators and journalists to ensure that revelations could not be suppressed. Harrington's continued investigation revealed that Evangelene had been working for at least 18 months with a network of individuals who shared her commitment to exposing the Newport complex activities. This network included federal investigators who were secretly documenting corruption in various government agencies, foreign journalists who were investigating American business practices from outside the reach of domestic intimidation, and even several wealthy individuals who had broken with their own families' participation in the conspiracy. The most significant member of this network was Dr. Helena Ash-ford, a physician and social reformer who had been investigating the connection between industrial accidents and inadequate medical care for workers. Dr. Ash-ford had initially become involved when she noticed that workers injured in railroad accidents were often treated by specific doctors who seemed more concerned with minimizing legal liability than providing appropriate medical care. Her investigation had revealed that several medical practitioners were being paid substantial fees to provide false diagnoses that would prevent injured workers from successfully suing railroad companies. Dr. Ash-ford had also discovered that certain hospitals were routinely disposing of workers' bodies without proper examination when they died from industrial injuries, often claiming that the families had requested immediate burial for religious reasons. In reality, these bodies were being destroyed to prevent independent medical examiners from finding evidence of criminal negligence or deliberate poisoning. Dr. Ash-ford's investigation had documented at least 37 cases where workers had been buried without proper medical examination, despite clear evidence that their deaths were suspicious. When Dr. Ash-ford had tried to present her findings to medical authorities and government officials, she had encountered the same pattern of obstruction and intimidation that other investigators had experienced. Medical boards claimed that her evidence was insufficient. Government officials insisted that existing regulations were adequate, and several hospitals where she had tried to conduct examinations suddenly declared that their records had been destroyed in routine housekeeping procedures. More seriously, Dr. Ash-ford had started to receive threats that became increasingly specific and personal. Anonymous letters warned her that lady doctors who interfere in matters beyond their understanding might find their medical licenses revoked, their reputations destroyed, or their personal safety compromised. When these threats failed to deter her investigation, she discovered that rumors were being spread about her professional competence and personal morality, clearly designed to discredit her work and isolate her from potential allies. Dr. Ash-ford's connection to Evangelene had begun when the young heiress approached her with questions about detecting poisons in human remains. Evangelene had presented herself as a wealthy dilettante with an interest in forensic medicine, but Dr. Ash-ford quickly realized that her visitor possessed sophisticated knowledge about criminal investigation techniques and was seeking information for specific practical purposes. Over several months, the two women had developed a collaborative relationship, with Dr. Ash-ford providing medical expertise while Evangelene contributed financial resources and access to business information. Their partnership had proven remarkably effective, allowing them to document the full scope of the Newport complex activities with a level of detail and scientific rigor that individual investigators could never have achieved. Dr. Ash-ford's medical knowledge enabled her to identify patterns of suspicious deaths that might otherwise have been missed, while Evangelene's business connections allowed her to trace financial relationships and document the flow of bribe money through various corporate entities. However, their collaboration had also made both women extremely dangerous to the Newport Compact, which had responded with increasingly sophisticated efforts to neutralize their investigation. Dr. Ash-ford discovered that medical colleagues were being pressured to avoid associating with her. Patients were being warned that she was mentally unstable, and hospitals were being told that employing her might result in a loss of funding from wealthy philanthropists. More ominously, Dr. Ash-ford began to experience incidents that suggested her personal safety was under threat. Her home was burglarized twice with no valuables stolen, but her medical records and investigation files carefully examined. She received anonymous letters containing detailed information about her daily routines, clearly indicating that she was under surveillance. Most disturbing of all, she discovered that someone had tried to tamper with her medical supplies, substituting dangerous substances for legitimate medications in a way that could have resulted in the accidental poisoning of her patients. As the pressure on both women intensified, they had developed increasingly sophisticated methods of protecting their investigation and ensuring that their evidence would survive even if they were eliminated. Evangelene had established the network of safety deposit boxes and foreign contacts that Captain Harrington had discovered, while Dr. Ash-ford had created her own system of hidden archives and automatic disclosure procedures. However, their most important innovation was the development of what they called the insurance policy, a comprehensive document that not only detailed the Newport complex criminal activities, but also provided evidence of the organization's efforts to suppress investigation and eliminate witnesses. This document was designed to be so damaging and comprehensive that its release would inevitably result in federal investigations, international diplomatic consequences, in criminal prosecutions that could not be suppressed through bribery or intimidation. The insurance policy contained not only documentation of past crimes, but also evidence of ongoing criminal activities and detailed predictions about future crimes that the Newport Compact was planning. This predictive element was crucial because it meant that if Evangelene and Dr. Ash-ford were eliminated, the subsequent fulfillment of their predictions would provide compelling evidence that their other allegations were accurate. On the evening of the summer's end ball, Evangelene had carried a copy of the insurance policy in the leather case that James Weatherby had seen her carrying down the mansion staircase. Her plan was to present this document to the assembled members of the Newport Compact, demanding that they confess their crimes and make restitution to their victims. If they refused, she would activate the automatic disclosure procedures that would simultaneously release the document to multiple newspapers, federal prosecutors, and foreign governments. What Evangelene had not anticipated was that the Newport Compact had developed their own intelligence network that had been monitoring her activities and had discovered at least some of her preparations. While they did not know the full extent of her evidence or the details of her disclosure procedures, they had learned enough to realize that she represented an existential threat to their organization. This intelligence had led to the decision documented in Judge Weatherby's authorization to eliminate her permanently rather than attempting further negotiation or intimidation. The confrontation that took place in Evangelene's chambers on the night of August 14th was not a spontaneous event, but rather a carefully planned operation that involved not only Theodore Patton and Judge Weatherby, but also several other members of the Newport Compact, who had positioned themselves strategically throughout the mansion to ensure that the operation could be completed without interference. However, before this confrontation took place, Harrington's investigation revealed that Evangelene had managed to complete one final act of defiance that would ultimately ensure a posthumous victory over the Newport Compact. At some point during the evening, she had succeeded in activating at least some of her disclosure procedures, sending coded telegrams to her network of allies and setting in motion the chain of events that would eventually expose the organization's crimes to public scrutiny. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Newport intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in this tale of Gilded Age corruption and murder. The truth about Evangelene Cunningham's final hours began to emerge through an extraordinary convergence of evidence that Captain Harrington would not fully piece together until months after the official investigation had been closed. The breakthrough came when Margaret Flynn, Evangeline's personal maid, finally found the courage to provide a complete account of what she had witnessed on the night of August 14, 1893. Flynn's testimony, corroborated by physical evidence and documentary materials that Evangeline had managed to preserve, revealed a confrontation of stunning brutality that demonstrated the lengths to which America's wealthiest families were prepared to go to protect their criminal empire. According to Flynn's detailed account, the confrontation in Evangeline's chambers had indeed taken place, but not as a spontaneous argument that escalated beyond control. Instead, it was a carefully orchestrated operation that involved extensive preparation and the participation of individuals who had clearly planned and rehearsed their roles. Flynn reported that she had observed unusual activity in the mansion throughout the evening, with several guests making multiple trips to what appeared to be a temporary command center that had been established in Heiress Cunningham's private study. At approximately 11:15 p.m., not 11:30, as she had initially reported, Flynn had heard voices in Evangeline's chambers. However, rather than simply listening through the keyhole, she had utilized a network of servant passages that allowed her to observe the confrontation from a concealed position that provided her with a clear view of most of the room. What she witnessed was not a heated argument, but rather a methodical interrogation designed to extract information about Evangeline's evidence and disclosure procedures. The participants in this interrogation included not only Theodore Petton, Judge Wetherbe, and Heiress Cunningham, but also Dr. Edmund Sheffield, the state medical examiner, and two other men whom Flynn did not recognize, but who appeared to be professional criminals rather than members of Newport society. These men were clearly there to provide specialized expertise in what Flynn euphemistically described as physical persuasion techniques. The interrogation began with Judge Wheeler presenting Evangeline with what he claimed was a legal document that would require her to surrender all evidence in her possession and submit to psychiatric evaluation for delusions and paranoid fantasies. When Evangeline refused to sign this document, Dr. Sheffield produced a medical bag containing what he described as therapeutic treatments that will help clarify your thinking about these unfortunate misunderstandings. Evangeline's response demonstrated both her courage and her sophisticated understanding of the legal and medical systems that were being used against her. She informed her captors that she had consulted with legal experts about such coercive tactics and understood that any confessions or surrenders of evidence obtained through force or medical coercion would be inadmissible in court. More importantly, she revealed that she had anticipated exactly this type of confrontation and had already activated legal and journalistic procedures that would ensure the truth would emerge regardless of what happened to her. At this point, according to Flynn's testimony, the tone of the confrontation changed dramatically. Judge Wetherbe abandoned any pretense of legal procedure and began to describe in graphic detail what would happen to Evangeline if she did not cooperate voluntarily. He explained that the Newport Compact had developed sophisticated methods for eliminating inconvenient individuals that left no trace of foul play and that they had successfully used these methods to eliminate dozens of people who had threatened their interests. Theodore Petton supplemented the judge's threats with detailed descriptions of what had happened to specific individuals who had previously attempted to expose the Newport Complex activities. He described the death of Congressman Hayes in Washington, the elimination of journalist Sarah Mitchell in Chicago, and several other cases that Flynn recognized from newspaper accounts she had read. Petton's knowledge of these cases was so detailed and intimate that it was clear he had been personally involved in planning and executing these murders. However, Evangeline's response to these revelations surprised her interrogators and demonstrated that she had understood far more about their organization than they had realized. She informed them that she had spent months documenting their involvement in these specific cases and had already provided detailed evidence about each murder to her network of investigators and journalists. She also revealed that she possessed evidence of their international connections, including correspondence with European criminal organizations and documentation of murders that had been committed in foreign countries. Most significantly, Evangeline revealed that she had evidence of the Newport Compact's involvement in what she termed the Philadelphia incident, a train derailment that had killed over 40 passengers and had been officially attributed to mechanical failure. According to her evidence, The derailment had been deliberately caused to eliminate a group of European investors who had been investigating irregularities in American railroad financing. The investors had been traveling together on a specific train, making them an ideal target for what appeared to be a tragic accident. The revelation about the Philadelphia incident created what Flynn described as a moment of absolute silence in the room as the interrogators realized that Evangelene possessed evidence of their most carefully concealed crime. This incident had involved not only multiple murders, but also the destruction of evidence that belonged to foreign governments, creating the potential for international diplomatic crises and criminal prosecutions that could not be controlled through domestic corruption. At this point, Dr. Sheffield produced a syringe containing what he described as a preparation that will provide immediate relief from these unfortunate delusions. However, Evangelene had anticipated this possibility as well and had prepared for it by consuming a substance that would counteract most common poisons and drugs. She had also positioned various items in her room that she could use as weapons if physical force became necessary. The final phase of the confrontation began when Evangelene attempted to reach the window that led to her emergency escape route. She had prepared this route months earlier, installing a rope ladder that would allow her to descend to a boat that she had hidden among the rocks below the mansion. However, the two professional criminals had anticipated this possibility and had positioned themselves to prevent her escape. According to Flynn's testimony, what followed was a brief but violent struggle during which Evangelene managed to fight off her attackers long enough to throw the leather case containing her most important evidence out the window, hoping that it would either be carried out to sea or recovered by allies who were monitoring the situation from boats positioned offshore. However, she was ultimately overwhelmed by superior numbers and was injected with Dr. Sheffield's therapeutic preparation. The drug did not kill Evangelene immediately, but rather induced a state of paralysis that left her conscious, but unable to move or speak. In this condition, she was forced to listen as her captors discussed the specific methods they would use to dispose of her body and eliminate any evidence of their involvement in her disappearance. Judge Weatherby explained that they would wait until the drug had fully taken effect, then transport her body to a boat that was waiting in a secluded cove several miles from the mansion. The boat would carry her body far out to sea, where it would be weighted and dropped into deep water that would prevent recovery, even if the location were somehow discovered. Her personal effects would be distributed in various locations to create the impression that she had fled voluntarily, while forged documents would be created to support the cover story that she had died in a tragic accident in Europe after eloping with a secret lover. However, even as she lay paralyzed and helpless, Evangelene managed to achieve one final victory over her murderers. Flynn observed that she was wearing a special ring that contained a hidden compartment and that she somehow managed to activate a mechanism that released a small amount of chemical powder into the air. This powder had been designed to react with specific substances to create a distinctive odor that would be detectable for several days, even after attempts to clean the room. More importantly, Flynn realized that the powder had been formulated to adhere to clothing and skin, meaning that anyone who was present during its release would carry traces of the chemical for weeks afterward. This would provide evidence that could potentially identify Evangelene's murderers if investigators were sophisticated enough to detect and analyze the chemical traces. Flynn's final observation was perhaps the most significant for understanding the full scope of the Newport Complex criminal enterprise. As the effects of the drug began to overwhelm Evangelene, Judge Weatherd made a telephone call using the private line in her room. Flynn could hear only one side of the conversation, but it was clear that the judge was reporting the success of the operation to someone who was not present in the mansion. The conversation included references to the Chicago situation and the London complications, suggesting that the Newport Compact was simultaneously conducting similar operations in multiple locations. Flynn heard the judge say, "The primary asset has been secured and the documentation issue has been contained. Recommend proceeding with Phase 2 of the containment protocol. The international complications should be resolved within 72 hours." This conversation confirmed that Evangelene's murder was part of a larger operation designed to eliminate multiple threats to the Newport Complex activities simultaneously. The organization had apparently identified several individuals in different locations who possessed dangerous evidence and had coordinated their elimination to prevent any surviving witnesses from piecing together the full scope of their crimes. The ultimate resolution of the Evangelene Cunningham case revealed both the extraordinary sophistication of the Newport Complex criminal operations and the remarkable effectiveness of the countermeasures that Evangelene had developed to ensure that her evidence would survive her murder. While her killers succeeded in eliminating her physically, they failed to prevent the disclosure of her evidence, resulting in consequences that ultimately destroyed their organization, even as it allowed most of the individual participants to escape legal punishment. The first breakthrough in exposing the Newport Compact came exactly 10 days after Evangelene's disappearance, when journalists at the New York World, the Boston Herald, and the Philadelphia Inquirer simultaneously received packages containing comprehensive documentation of the organization's criminal activities. These packages had been mailed from multiple post offices across New England using a system that Evangelene had developed to ensure that even if some deliveries were intercepted, enough evidence would reach its intended recipients to guarantee exposure. The packages contained not only copies of the Newport Compact's internal documents, but also detailed analyses that Evangelene had prepared with the help of Dr. Ash-ford and other collaborators. These analyses demonstrated connections between apparently unrelated deaths, explained the methods used to corrupt government officials and medical examiners, and provided a comprehensive organizational chart that revealed the full scope of the conspiracy. Most significantly, the packages included predictions about specific actions that the Newport Compact would take in response to Evangelene's disappearance. These predictions proved remarkably accurate, as the organization's efforts to suppress investigation and eliminate witnesses followed patterns that Evangelene had anticipated based on her study of their previous operations. When these predictions were fulfilled with precise accuracy, they provided compelling evidence that Evangelene's other allegations were equally reliable. The newspaper investigations that followed generated enormous public outrage and political pressure that even the Newport Complex's extensive corruption network could not completely suppress. Federal prosecutors were forced to open investigations. Congressional committees demanded hearings, and international diplomatic pressure began to mount as European governments realized that their citizens had been murdered by American business interests. However, the legal consequences for individual members of the Newport Compact were surprisingly limited, demonstrating the extent to which wealth and political influence could shield criminals from prosecution, even when their crimes were extensively documented and publicly revealed. Heiress Cunningham died of what was officially reported as a heart attack just 2 weeks after the first newspaper stories appeared. Though the rapid onset of his symptoms and the circumstances of his death were consistent with poisoning, his death eliminated the prosecutor's most important potential witness and made it difficult to pursue charges against other organization members. Theodore Peton fled to Argentina just days before federal marshals arrived to arrest him, using financial resources and transportation networks that the Newport Compact had established for exactly such emergencies. He lived under an assumed name on a remote estate until his death in 1923, never returning to the United States, but continuing to coordinate with other organization members through encrypted correspondence and financial transfers. Judge Weatherby was quietly removed from the bench and retired to a private estate in California, officially due to health concerns, but actually as part of a negotiated agreement that allowed him to avoid prosecution in exchange for providing limited information about the organization's judicial corruption activities. However, the information he provided was carefully selected to protect the most important participants while sacrificing lower-level associates who had become liabilities. Dr. Sheffield, the medical examiner, committed suicide rather than face prosecution, but not before destroying extensive records that would have provided evidence of his involvement in covering up numerous murders. His death was itself suspicious, as he was found in his office with a gunshot wound that could have been either self-inflicted or administered by someone seeking to prevent him from revealing information about other organization members. Of the 7 families identified as Newport Compact members, only 2 faced serious legal consequences, and even these were limited to financial penalties and social ostracism rather than criminal prosecution. 3 family patriarchs died under suspicious circumstances within months of the revelations, apparently victims of the same elimination methods they had used against their own enemies. The remaining families used their wealth and political connections to avoid prosecution, though their reputations were permanently damaged and their business operations were severely disrupted. The most tragic aspect of the case was the systematic elimination of witnesses and potential informants that followed the public revelations. Margaret Flynn, whose testimony had been crucial to understanding Evangelene's fate, disappeared shortly after giving her statement to investigators. She was reportedly seen boarding a train to Chicago, carrying a suitcase and what appeared to be a substantial amount of cash, but no further trace of her was ever found despite extensive searches by both law enforcement and private investigators. Patrick O'Brien, the night watchman, whose observations had corroborated Flynn's testimony, died in what was ruled an accidental drowning 3 months after the investigation concluded. However, the circumstances of his death, he was found in a mill pond despite being an experienced swimmer who had no reason to be in that location, suggested that he had been murdered to prevent him from providing additional testimony. Dr. Helena Ash-ford, who had been Evangelene's primary collaborator in documenting the Newport complex activities, survived longer than most witnesses, but was ultimately eliminated in a manner that demonstrated the organization's sophisticated methods. She died in what appeared to be a laboratory accident, apparently overcome by chemical fumes while conducting research. However, investigation of the accident revealed that her laboratory's ventilation system had been deliberately sabotaged in a way that required extensive technical knowledge and careful planning. The elimination of witnesses continued for several years after the initial revelations, creating a pattern of deaths that was clearly deliberate, but sufficiently spread out over time and geography to avoid attracting attention from law enforcement agencies that were not specifically looking for connections. In total, at least 15 individuals who had provided evidence or assistance related to the Evangelene Cunningham investigation died under suspicious circumstances between 1893 and 1897. However, the most significant long-term consequence of the case was the gradual transformation of investigative journalism and federal law enforcement that resulted from the techniques that Evangelene had pioneered. Her methods of gathering evidence, preserving it securely, and coordinating with multiple investigators and journalists became standard practices for reporters investigating powerful interests. Several prominent journalists of the early 20th century cited the Newport Compact expose as their inspiration for entering the field and credited Evangelene's techniques with making their own investigations possible. The federal government also began to develop more sophisticated methods for investigating corporate crimes and political corruption, partly in response to the evidence that the Newport Compact had been able to operate for over 15 years without detection despite committing dozens of murders and stealing millions of dollars. New agencies were created with specialized expertise in financial crimes, interstate criminal conspiracies, and the corruption of government officials. Perhaps most importantly, the international diplomatic consequences of the case led to the development of new treaties and agreements designed to prevent American businesses from committing crimes against foreign citizens with impunity. Several countries established special investigative units to monitor American business activities within their borders, and international cooperation in criminal investigations was significantly enhanced. The Cunningham fortune was eventually inherited by distant relatives who had no connection to the railroad business and no knowledge of the Newport Compact's activities. These relatives sold most of the family's business interests and used the proceeds to establish charitable foundations focused on worker safety and industrial accident prevention, a fitting memorial to the 17 workers who had died in the Baltimore Bridge collapse and the dozens of other victims of corporate negligence. Windward Hall, the mansion where Evangelene had been murdered, was sold and converted into a luxury hotel. Though the business struggled due to persistent reports of unexplained phenomena in the rooms that had once been Evangelene's private chambers, guests reported hearing voices in the walls, finding documents that would disappear when examined closely, and experiencing dreams that seemed to contain detailed information about historical events they had no way of knowing. The mansion was eventually demolished in 1932 after a suspicious fire that destroyed most of the building, including the room where Evangelene had died. The leather case that Evangelene had thrown from her window during her final struggle was never officially recovered despite extensive searches of the coastline and ocean floor. However, there are persistent rumors that it was actually found by local fishermen who recognized its importance and secretly turned it over to federal investigators. According to these rumors, the case contained evidence of even more extensive corruption, possibly involving federal politicians, Supreme Court justices, and international business conspiracies that extended far beyond the Newport Compact's American operations. Some historians believe that this additional evidence was suppressed by federal authorities who concluded that its revelation would cause such extensive political and economic disruption that it would threaten the stability of the American government itself. According to this theory, certain government officials made a calculated decision to prosecute lower-level participants in the Newport Compact while protecting higher-level figures whose exposure would have created an unmanageable political crisis. The most persistent mystery surrounding the case concerns the ultimate fate of what Evangelene had termed the insurance policy, the comprehensive document that detailed not only past crimes, but also predicted future activities of the Newport Compact. While portions of this document were clearly included in the materials that reached newspapers and prosecutors, there are indications that additional sections existed that were never publicly revealed. Contemporary observers noted that several specific predictions included in the revealed portions of the insurance policy were fulfilled with remarkable precision in the years following Angelena's death. But other predictions that were referenced in private correspondence were never publicly disclosed. This suggests that some portions of the document may have been suppressed by authorities who recognized that their revelation would have consequences extending far beyond the prosecution of the Newport Compact members. In the end, Evangelene Cunningham's story serves as both an inspiration and a warning about the possibilities and limitations of individual courage in confronting systematic corruption. Her sophisticated understanding of criminal investigation techniques, her ability to build networks of allies and collaborators, and her careful preparation of evidence preservation and disclosure procedures enabled her to achieve a posthumous victory over her murderers that would have been impossible for a less prepared and resourceful individual. However, her story also demonstrates the brutal effectiveness of organized wealth and power in protecting itself through violence and intimidation. Even though her evidence ultimately exposed the Newport Compact's activities and led to the destruction of their organization, most of the individual participants escaped serious punishment and continued to live comfortable lives supported by wealth that had been accumulated through murder and theft. Perhaps the most important lesson of the Evangelene Cunningham case is that the struggle between justice and corruption is not a single battle that can be won or lost definitively, but rather an ongoing conflict that requires constant vigilance and courage from individuals who are willing to risk their personal safety for the greater good. Evangelene's sacrifice contributed to improvements in worker safety, government accountability, and journalistic independence that benefited millions of people, but the fundamental systems that enabled the Newport Compact to operate, the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a small elite, remained largely unchanged. This mystery shows us that even in the face of overwhelming corruption and violence, individual conscience and courage can make a difference. The truth has a way of surviving even when powerful forces attempt to bury it beneath layers of money, influence, and intimidation. Evangelene Cunningham's evidence survived her murder and ultimately achieved the justice she had sought, though at a cost that demonstrates the true price of challenging entrenched power. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Or might there be more secrets still hidden in the archives of America's wealthiest families? The techniques that Evangelene developed for investigating corporate crimes are still used by journalists and law enforcement agencies today, suggesting that her legacy continues to threaten those who would use wealth and power to exploit and harm others. Leave your comment below about what you think really happened to that missing leather case and whether similar conspiracies might still be operating today. If you enjoyed this tale and want more historical mysteries like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves dark stories from America's past. See you in the next one.